It was a crisp autumn evening in the small town of Riverton, where life moved at a steady and predictable pace. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the quiet streets. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson, a man whose presence commanded respect, was driving home after attending his daughter's school play. He had spent the evening watching her perform on stage, beaming with pride as she delivered her lines with confidence. As he drove through the tree-lined roads of his neighborhood, he felt content, a rare moment of peace amidst the demands of his military career. But that sense of calm shattered abruptly when red and blue lights flashed behind him. At first, Marcus wasn't sure what to make of it. He hadn't been speeding, nor had he broken any traffic rules. Still, being the disciplined individual he was, he signaled and pulled over smoothly onto the shoulder of the road. His heart rate quickened, slightly. Even someone like Marcus, who had faced danger on battlefields, couldn't help but feel uneasy. During interactions with law enforcement these days, stories of unfair treatment toward people who looked like him were all too common, and they weighed heavily on his mind. Officer Daniel Hargrove stepped out of his patrol car, his movements brisk and deliberate. To those who knew him, Hargrove was infamous for his short temper and aggressive demeanor. Over the years, he'd accumulated numerous complaints from residents about his behavior, though none had ever led to serious consequences for him. Tonight, however, something about this routine stop felt different. Perhaps it was the sleek black SUV parked ahead or the distinguished-looking man sitting inside. Whatever it was, Hargrove approached the vehicle with an air of suspicion that bordered on hostility. Marcus rolled down his window as Hargrove neared, his posture relaxed yet alert. "Good evening, officer," he said politely, his voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Hargrove barely acknowledged the greeting. Instead, he leaned forward, peering into the car with narrowed eyes. "License and registration," he barked, his tone sharp and dismissive. Marcus nodded calmly and reached for his wallet, careful to move slowly so as not to alarm the officer. It was standard procedure, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this interaction was already veering off course. As Marcus handed over his documents, Hargrove glanced at them briefly before snapping. "You know why I pulled you over?" "No, sir, I don't," Marcus replied evenly, maintaining eye contact. "I wasn't speeding and my lights were working fine." Hargrove sneered, clearly unimpressed by Marcus's composed demeanor. "Don't play dumb with me," he shot back. "This is a nice car. Where'd you get the money for it? You steal it?" The accusation hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he stared at the officer, stunned by the audacity of the question. Here he was, a decorated Army lieutenant colonel, a man who had dedicated decades of his life to serving his country, and this stranger was accusing him of theft based on nothing more than prejudice. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but Marcus forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help the situation. "I'm a soldier," Marcus said firmly, keeping his voice level. "I've served 20 years in the military. This car belongs to me, and I can assure you it wasn't stolen." But Hargrove wasn't listening. If anything, Marcus's response seemed to fuel his animosity further. Without warning, the officer stepped back, his hand moving instinctively to the holster on his hip. In one swift motion, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Marcus's head. The barrel gleamed menacingly under the flickering streetlights. "Get out of the car," Hargrove shouted, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. "Hands where I can see them." Time seemed to freeze. Marcus's mind raced as adrenaline surged through his veins. Every instinct screamed at him to defend himself, but he knew better. One wrong move could cost him his life. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands above the steering wheel, palms open to show he posed no threat. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice strained but controlled. "Why are you pointing your weapon at me?" "Shut up," Hargrove snapped, his face contorted with rage. "You think you're better than me because you drive a fancy car? Think again." The absurdity of the situation struck Marcus like a ton of bricks. How had things escalated so quickly? All he'd done was pull over for a routine traffic stop. Yet here he was staring down the barrel of a gun, simply because of the color of his skin. It was a sobering reminder of the harsh realities faced by countless others every single day. For several agonizing minutes, Hargrove kept the gun trained on Marcus, refusing to lower it despite the lack of any provocation. Cars passed by on the road, their drivers glancing curiously at the scene unfolding on the side of the street. Some slowed down, perhaps sensing the tension in the air, while others sped past without a second thought. Eventually, backup arrived, in the form of 2 additional officers, summoned by Hargrove via radio earlier in the encounter. The arrival of reinforcements did little to ease the situation. While one of the new officers attempted to diffuse the tension, the other stood silently, observing the exchange with a mixture of confusion and unease. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Hargrove holstered his weapon and ordered Marcus to step out of the car. The ordeal wasn't over yet, but at least the immediate threat had subsided. As Marcus complied with the demand, his thoughts swirled with anger, frustration, and disbelief. He couldn't believe this was happening. Not to him, not here, not now. But deep down, he also knew that this moment would not define him. No matter how unjust or infuriating the circumstances, he vowed to rise above them. Little did he know, this encounter would spark a chain reaction of events that would reverberate far beyond the confines of this quiet suburban street. Word spread quickly about the incident involving Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson and Officer Daniel Hargrove. By the next morning, whispers of what had happened rippled through Riverton like a stone dropped into still water. Neighbors who had witnessed parts of the confrontation from their windows or heard the commotion began sharing snippets of information with one another. Some described seeing Hargrove's aggressive stance and the unmistakable glint of his drawn weapon under the streetlights. Others recounted how they saw Marcus standing calmly beside his car, hands raised in surrender, as if trying to reason with an unreasonable man. But it wasn't until the dashcam footage surfaced online that the story truly exploded. A passerby had recorded part of the encounter on their phone, capturing Hargrove's belligerent tone and the chilling moment when he pulled his gun on Marcus. The video went viral almost instantly, shared across social media platforms by people outraged at what they were witnessing. Within hours, hashtags like Justice for Marcus and End Police Brutality began trending nationwide. Screenshots of the clip appeared on news websites, accompanied by headlines questioning whether this was yet another example of systemic racism within law enforcement. The public reaction was swift and fierce. Protesters gathered outside the Riverton Police Department holding signs that read, "Accountability now and no justice, no peace." Many carried pictures of Marcus, his face stern but dignified in his military uniform. Among the crowd were members of local activist groups, civil rights organizations, and even some veterans who felt compelled to stand in solidarity with Marcus. Their chants echoed through the streets. "Enough is enough," and "We demand change." Inside the police station, tensions ran high. Officers braced themselves for backlash, knowing full well that incidents like this eroded trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Chief Raymond Caldwell, a grizzled veteran of the force, called an emergency press conference to address the growing storm. Standing behind a podium emblazoned with the department's logo, he looked visibly uncomfortable as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions at him. "Let me be clear," Caldwell began, his voice firm but measured. "What happened last night is deeply concerning, and we are committed to getting to the bottom of it. Officer Hargrove has been placed on administrative leave pending a thorough investigation. We will cooperate fully with any inquiries and ensure transparency throughout this process." While Caldwell's words may have sounded reassuring, many weren't satisfied. Critics pointed out that similar promises had been made in the past after other high-profile cases, only for little to come of them. For every officer held accountable, there seemed to be countless others whose actions went unpunished. Trust in institutions like the police department wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, especially not with platitudes delivered during press conferences. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight in ways he never anticipated. Friends and family urged him to stay silent, fearing retaliation or further harm. But Marcus knew silence wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it would allow moments like this to fade into obscurity, without sparking meaningful dialogue or action. So, against his better judgment, he agreed to speak publicly about his experience. His first interview aired on a popular morning talk show. Dressed in civilian clothes, Marcus sat across from the host, his expression a mix of exhaustion and resolve. When asked how he felt about the incident, he didn't mince words. It was humiliating, Marcus admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I've dedicated my life to serving this country, putting myself in harm's way so others can live freely. Yet here I was, treated like a criminal simply because of the color of my skin. That kind of prejudice cuts deep. It makes you question whether all your sacrifices were worth it. The audience listened intently, hanging on to every word. Some viewers wiped away tears while others nodded in agreement, recognizing echoes of their own experiences in Marcus's story. Social media lit up once again, this time flooded with messages of support for Marcus. Hashtags celebrating his bravery trended alongside calls for justice. People praised him not just for speaking out, but for doing so with grace and dignity. Despite the trauma he endured, national news outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach even further. Journalists delved into Hargrove's history, uncovering a pattern of misconduct complaints filed against him over the years. Former colleagues painted a troubling picture of a man whose temper often got the better of him, particularly when dealing with minority residents. One former partner described Hargrove as a loose cannon who frequently disregarded protocol in favor of intimidation tactics. These revelations added fuel to the fire, intensifying demands for accountability. Amidst the chaos, Marcus received both unexpected allies and harsh critics. Supporters rallied around him, organizing fundraisers to cover legal fees should he decide to pursue charges against Hargrove. Local businesses donated proceeds to advocacy groups working to combat racial profiling and police brutality. Even strangers reached out, sending heartfelt letters and gifts to show their solidarity. But not everyone sided with Marcus. Inevitably, there were those who defended Hargrove, claiming he was just doing his job or suggesting that Marcus must have done something to provoke him. Comment sections beneath articles devolved into heated debates, with insults hurled back and forth. Trolls targeted Marcus online, leaving vile comments designed to intimidate him into silence. Despite the negativity, Marcus refused to let it deter him. He understood that progress rarely came without resistance, and he was determined to see this fight through to the end. As days turned into weeks, the momentum continued to build. Activists organized town hall meetings to discuss systemic issues within law enforcement and brainstorm solutions. Educators incorporated discussions about racial bias into classroom curriculums, encouraging students to think critically about fairness and equality. Churches hosted prayer vigils, calling for healing and unity in a divided community. Even politicians took notice. State representatives introduced legislation aimed at increasing accountability measures for officers accused of misconduct. Federal authorities announced plans to investigate potential civil rights violations stemming from the incident. While these developments offered hope, Marcus remained cautiously optimistic. He knew changing deeply ingrained systems wouldn't happen overnight, but he also believed persistence could yield results. Throughout it all, Marcus leaned heavily on his loved ones for support. His wife, Sarah, stood by his side steadfastly, attending interviews and rallies alongside him. She often reminded him to take care of himself, urging him to step away from the whirlwind whenever he needed a break. Their daughter, Emily, struggled to comprehend why her father had been treated so unfairly. At school, classmates bombarded her with questions, some curious and others cruel. It was a lot for a teenager to handle, but she drew strength from her parents' resilience. In quieter moments, Marcus reflected on everything that had transpired since that fateful night. He thought about the countless others who hadn't been as fortunate, those whose names became hashtags because they didn't survive encounters like his. He realized his platform gave him a unique opportunity to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. And while the weight of responsibility sometimes felt overwhelming, he embraced it, knowing he owed it to those who couldn't speak for themselves. By the time the initial wave of outrage began to subside, Marcus understood one thing clearly. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about exposing flaws in a system that perpetuated inequality and demanding reforms to create a safer, fairer society for future generations. As daunting as the road ahead seemed, Marcus vowed to keep pushing forward one step at a time. The investigation into Officer Daniel Hargrove's conduct began with a sense of urgency that was rare for cases like this. Normally, internal affairs departments moved at a glacial pace, dragging out inquiries until public interest waned and the story faded into obscurity. But this time was different. The sheer volume of attention, from protesters filling the streets to national news outlets dissecting every detail, forced the Riverton Police Department to act swiftly. Chief Raymond Caldwell knew any misstep could further damage the already fragile trust between his officers and the community they served. From the outset, the department faced immense pressure from all sides. Local activists demanded transparency, insisting that anything less would be seen as an attempt to protect one of their own. Civil rights organizations filed formal complaints, calling for independent oversight to ensure impartiality. Even government officials weighed in, urging accountability not just for Hargrove but for the system that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. For once, it seemed everyone agreed on one thing: justice had to prevail. Marcus Thompson played a pivotal role in the investigation, providing investigators with a detailed account of what transpired during the traffic stop. He recounted how Hargrove's demeanor shifted almost immediately after approaching his car, escalating from routine questioning to outright hostility without provocation. Marcus described the accusatory tone Hargrove used when asking about the car's ownership, the baseless insinuations of theft, and finally the chilling moment when the officer drew his weapon. Each word he spoke carried weight, painting a vivid picture of an encounter marred by prejudice and aggression. To corroborate Marcus's testimony, investigators reviewed multiple sources of evidence. The dashcam footage from Hargrove's patrol car provided undeniable proof of the officer's actions, capturing both his verbal tirade and the unmistakable sight of him pointing his gun at Marcus. Bystanders who had recorded snippets of the incident added additional context, showing passers-by stopping to watch in disbelief as the confrontation unfolded. Surveillance cameras mounted on nearby buildings also offered glimpses of the scene, reinforcing the narrative that no threat had been posed by Marcus at any point. Perhaps most damning were the civilian witnesses who came forward. A young couple, walking their dog near the area where the traffic stop occurred, recounted hearing Hargrove shout derogatory remarks at Marcus before drawing his weapon. "It was terrifying," the woman later told investigators. "We didn't know what was going to happen next. All we saw was an unarmed man being treated like a criminal." Another witness, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Lane, described seeing Hargrove pacing back and forth with his gun drawn, seemingly unable to de-escalate the situation despite having backup arrive moments later. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, cracks began to form within the police department itself. Some officers privately expressed discomfort with Hargrove's behavior, acknowledging that his reputation for volatility made them uneasy long before this incident occurred. Others, however, clung tightly to the blue wall of silence, refusing to speak out against a fellow officer, regardless of the circumstances. This division created tension among the ranks, with whispers of dissent spreading through locker rooms and briefing sessions. Despite initial resistance from higher-ups within the department, federal authorities intervened, citing potential civil rights violations. Agents from the Department of Justice joined the investigation, bringing with them resources and expertise that local law enforcement lacked. Their involvement sent a clear message: this case wouldn't disappear quietly. Federal prosecutors pored over the evidence, analyzing every frame of video footage and scrutinizing witness statements for inconsistencies. They also delved into Hargrove's disciplinary record, uncovering a troubling pattern of complaints, alleging excessive force and racial bias. Though none of these allegations had resulted in serious consequences for Hargrove in the past, they now served as critical context for understanding his mindset and motivations. Hargrove's defense team worked tirelessly to counter the mounting evidence against him, Led by a seasoned attorney known for defending controversial clients, they crafted a strategy centered around portraying the incident as a misunderstanding rather than an act of malice. In interviews with the media, Hargrove claimed he acted out of perceived self-defense, arguing that Marcus's calm demeanor had unnerved him and led him to believe there might be a hidden threat. Officer Hargrove made a judgment call based on the information available to him at the time, his lawyer stated during a press conference. He regrets if his actions caused distress, but he was simply following protocol. This argument, however, failed to hold up under scrutiny. Investigators pointed out that Hargrove ignored basic principles of de-escalation, opting instead for intimidation tactics that only served to escalate the situation further. Experts brought in to review the case noted that Hargrove's decision to draw his weapon so quickly and maintain it pointed at Marcus for several minutes violated standard training protocols designed to minimize risk. Furthermore, transcripts of Hargrove's radio communications revealed no indication that he believed himself to be in imminent danger, undermining his claims of feeling threatened. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded beyond the events of that single night. Prosecutors began examining broader patterns of misconduct within the Riverton Police Department, probing whether Hargrove's actions represented a systemic issue rather than an isolated incident. Internal memos and personnel files were subpoenaed, shedding light on instances where similar complaints had been dismissed or swept under the rug. What emerged was a portrait of an institution struggling to adapt to changing societal expectations, clinging to outdated practices that prioritized authority over accountability. Throughout this process, Marcus remained actively involved, attending meetings with investigators and legal teams to ensure his voice was heard. He understood the importance of staying engaged, not just for his sake, but for the countless others who looked to him as a symbol of resilience. At the same time, he grappled with the emotional toll of reliving the incident over and over again. Friends and family urged him to take breaks, reminding him that fighting for justice didn't mean sacrificing his well-being. Still, Marcus refused to step back entirely, knowing that momentum was key to achieving meaningful change. By the time the investigation concluded, the findings painted a damning picture of Hargrove's conduct. Not only had he violated departmental policies and federal laws, but he had done so with a blatant disregard for human dignity. The report recommended criminal charges, setting the stage for what promised to be a landmark trial. Activists celebrated the development as a victory, though tempered by the knowledge that convictions were far from guaranteed. For Marcus, it marked another step toward closure, but also another reminder of the uphill battle ahead. In the days leading up to the trial, anticipation hung thick in the air. Supporters rallied outside courthouses, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding accountability. Critics questioned whether the outcome would truly reflect justice or merely serve as a symbolic gesture meant to placate public outrage. Amidst the uncertainty, one thing remained clear. The eyes of the nation were watching, waiting to see whether this case would become a turning point in the fight against systemic racism, or yet another missed opportunity. Behind the scenes of public appearances, interviews, and rallies, Marcus Thompson wrestled with emotions that were far more complex than he let on. While his outward demeanor remained composed and dignified, a testament to years of military training, inside he was navigating a storm of anxiety, anger, and vulnerability. The incident with Officer Daniel Hargrove had left scars that weren't visible but ran deep, affecting not only him but also his family. For Marcus, the struggle wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about reclaiming a sense of safety and normalcy in a world where even routine interactions could turn dangerous. At first, Marcus tried to downplay the impact of what had happened. He told himself that he'd faced worse situations during his deployments overseas, that this was simply another challenge to overcome. But no amount of self-talk could silence the voice inside his head whenever he saw flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Every time he drove past a police car, his heart raced, his palms grew sweaty, and he felt an overwhelming urge to double-check his speedometer, even though he knew he wasn't breaking any laws. The irrational fear gnawed at him, reminding him that the color of his skin made him vulnerable in ways others might never understand. It wasn't just the physical danger that haunted him. It was the humiliation. Marcus had always prided himself on being a man of honor, someone who commanded respect through hard work, discipline, and integrity. Yet, in those moments when Hargrove pointed his gun at him, all of that seemed irrelevant. His accomplishments, his rank, his service to the country, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the stereotype Hargrove projected onto him. A black man in a nice car, automatically presumed guilty until proven innocent. That realization stung more than Marcus cared to admit. His wife, Sarah, noticed the changes almost immediately. Marcus, who had always been a pillar of strength for their family, now seemed distant and preoccupied. Nights that used to be filled with laughter and conversation turned quiet as Marcus retreated into his thoughts. Sometimes, she would wake up in the middle of the night to find him sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness. When she asked if he wanted to talk, he often brushed her off, saying he was fine. But Sarah knew better. She recognized the signs of someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. One evening, after putting their daughter Emily to bed, Sarah sat down beside Marcus on the couch. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "I know you're hurting." Marcus hesitated before responding. "I don't know how to explain it," he admitted finally, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's like, I've always believed in doing the right thing and treating people fairly, but now I feel like the system doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't care about who I am or what I've done, and that makes me question everything." Sarah listened quietly, her heart breaking for the man she loved. She wished she could take away his pain, shield him from the harsh realities of the world. But she knew she couldn't. Instead, she offered the only thing she could: unwavering support. "You're not alone in this," she assured him. "We'll get through it together." For Emily, the aftermath of the incident brought its own set of challenges. At 13 years old, she was old enough to understand the gravity of what had happened, but still too young to fully process it. Her classmates bombarded her with questions, some curious. "What was it like seeing your dad on TV?" And others cruel. "Why did the cop pull him over?" Teachers tried to intervene, organizing classroom discussions about race and bias. But Emily often felt singled out, as if her family's ordeal had somehow become a lesson plan rather than a deeply personal tragedy. Despite the difficulties, Emily found solace in writing. Inspired by her father's courage, she began journaling her thoughts, pouring her fears and frustrations onto paper. One entry read, "Dad is my hero. He protects our country and takes care of us. But why do people treat him like he's bad? It's not fair." Another page included sketches of protest signs she'd seen online, alongside notes about how she wanted to make a difference when she grew up. Though her words were simple, they reflected a maturity beyond her years, a desire to fight for a better future. As the weeks went by, Marcus realized he couldn't keep bottling up his emotions. Talking to Sarah helped, but he needed more. A close friend recommended therapy, suggesting it might provide a safe space to unpack the trauma he'd experienced. Initially reluctant, therapy wasn't something he'd ever considered necessary. Marcus decided to give it a try. To his surprise, the sessions proved invaluable. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to confront the anger and helplessness he'd buried beneath layers of stoicism. His therapist encouraged him to channel those feelings into action, emphasizing that healing wasn't just about moving past pain, but using it to create positive change. Determined to regain control of his narrative, Marcus threw himself into advocacy work. He joined forces with local grassroots organizations dedicated to combating police brutality and systemic racism. Together, they organized community forums, workshops, and educational programs aimed at fostering dialogue between residents and law enforcement. Marcus became a powerful speaker, sharing his story with audiences ranging from high school students to policymakers. Each speech reinforced his belief that transparency and accountability were essential for rebuilding trust. One particularly Impactful event took place at Riverton High School, where Marcus addressed a packed auditorium of teenagers. Standing on stage, he spoke candidly about his experience, describing the fear and indignation he felt when Hargrove drew his weapon. "I want you to remember," he told the crowd, "that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Regardless of their background, if you see injustice, speak up. Don't stay silent. Change starts with each of us." The response was overwhelming. Students lined up afterward to thank Marcus, many expressing admiration for his bravery. Some shared their own stories of discrimination, while others asked how they could get involved in activism. Seeing young people inspired to take action gave Marcus hope, not just for himself but for future generations. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the weight of the world pressed down on him, Marcus wondered if anything he was doing truly mattered. Would holding one officer accountable make a dent in a system riddled with flaws? Could raising awareness really lead to lasting reform? On those nights, Sarah reminded him of the ripple effect his efforts were creating. "You may not see the full impact right away," she said, "but you're planting seeds, and someday those seeds will grow." By leaning on his family, seeking professional help, and immersing himself in advocacy, Marcus slowly began to heal. The road ahead remained uncertain, fraught with obstacles and setbacks. But he refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he chose to focus on what he could control: his actions, his words, and his commitment to making the world a better place. In doing so, he transformed his pain into purpose, emerging stronger and more determined than ever to fight for justice, not just for himself but for everyone who deserved to live without fear. The trial of Officer Daniel Hargrove loomed large over Riverton, a town now divided by the weight of anticipation and uncertainty. For months, the case had dominated headlines, sparking heated debates at dinner tables, in classrooms, and on social media. As the court date approached, the atmosphere grew tense, with both sides bracing for what promised to be a landmark legal battle. Prosecutors and defense attorneys worked tirelessly behind the scenes, meticulously preparing their arguments, knowing that the outcome would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. For Marcus Thompson, the weeks leading up to the trial were a whirlwind of preparation and reflection. He met regularly with the prosecution team, poring over evidence and rehearsing his testimony. The prosecutors, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Nguyen, understood the significance of this case and were determined to present an airtight argument. They knew they weren't just fighting for justice for Marcus. They were fighting to expose the cracks in a system that too often shielded officers like Hargrove from accountability. Rachel's strategy hinged on painting a clear picture of Hargrove's actions as reckless, discriminatory, and unjustifiable. She planned to use the dashcam footage, witness statements, and expert analysis to dismantle any claims that Hargrove had acted out of self-defense or followed proper protocol. "This isn't just about one bad officer," Rachel told Marcus during one of their meetings. "It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it." Marcus nodded, absorbing her words. He appreciated Rachel's determination but couldn't shake the feeling of unease gnawing at him. Testifying in court meant revisiting the most harrowing night of his life, reliving every detail under the scrutiny of lawyers, judges, and spectators. It also meant facing Hargrove directly, a prospect that filled him with equal parts dread and resolve. Still, Marcus knew he couldn't back down. His testimony wasn't just about seeking retribution, it was about standing up for truth and fairness. On the other side of the aisle, Hargrove's defense team crafted a narrative designed to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Their primary goal was to humanize Hargrove, portraying him as a dedicated officer caught in a difficult situation rather than a rogue cop driven by prejudice. Defense attorney Gregory Lane, known for his sharp wit and persuasive tactics, argued that Hargrove's actions stemmed from split-second decisions made under pressure, a claim he hoped would resonate with jurors. To bolster their argument, the UEU defense called upon several character witnesses, including fellow officers who vouched for Hargrove's professionalism and dedication to duty. They also enlisted experts to challenge the interpretation of the dashcam footage, arguing that angles and lighting might have distorted perceptions of the incident. Lane planned to highlight inconsistencies in civilian testimonies, suggesting that bystanders' recollections were unreliable due to the chaos of the moment. As the trial began, the courtroom buzzed with energy. Reporters jostled for seats, cameras clicking furiously as participants filed in. Activists held vigils outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "No more excuses." Inside, the air was thick with tension, each side acutely aware of the stakes involved. Judge Cynthia Morales presided over the proceedings, her stern demeanor setting the tone for what promised to be a rigorous and emotionally charged trial. The prosecution opened its case with a powerful opening statement. Rachel stood before the jury, her voice steady and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "what you are about to hear is not just the story of one man's encounter with law enforcement. It is the story of systemic failures, unchecked biases, and the devastating consequences they can have on innocent lives." On the night of October 15th, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson, a decorated soldier, a loving father, and a pillar of our community, was treated not as a citizen deserving respect but as a suspect based solely on the color of his skin. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. Officer Daniel Hargrove violated not only departmental policies but also fundamental principles of humanity. Tonight we will show you irrefutable evidence proving that his actions were unwarranted, excessive, and rooted in prejudice. We ask you to hold him accountable, not just for the sake of justice, but for the sake of progress. When it was Lane's turn to speak, he wasted no time countering the prosecution's narrative. "My client, Officer Hargrove, is a man who has devoted his life to protecting others," he declared, pacing confidently in front of the jury box. "Yes, mistakes were made that night, but let us not forget the immense pressure faced by officers tasked with making life or death decisions in seconds. Was Officer Hargrove perfect? No. But perfection is not the standard here. Reasonableness is. And I assure you, when all the facts come to light, you will see that Officer Hargrove acted reasonably given the circumstances." Over the next several days, the prosecution presented its case, methodically building a timeline of events supported by video footage, audio recordings, and first-hand accounts. Witnesses took the stand, recounting what they saw and heard during the traffic stop. Margaret Lane, the retired schoolteacher who had been walking her dog nearby, described how Hargrove's aggressive behavior escalated without provocation. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, she testified. "Never have I seen anything like that. It was terrifying." Expert witnesses provided additional context, explaining why Hargrove's decision to draw his weapon so quickly violated standard de-escalation practices. A former police trainer testified that pointing a gun at someone should always be a last resort, reserved for situations where there is an immediate threat to life. In this case, he argued, no such threat existed. Finally, it was Marcus's turn to testify. Dressed in a crisp suit, he walked to the witness stand with quiet confidence, his presence commanding attention. As Rachel guided him through his account of the incident, Marcus spoke clearly and calmly, never raising his voice despite the gravity of his words. He described the initial traffic stop, Hargrove's accusatory questions, and the moment when the officer drew his gun. When asked how he felt during the encounter, Marcus hesitated briefly before responding. "Humiliated," he said, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "I served my country for 20 years, risking my life to protect people's freedoms. Yet here I was, treated like a criminal because of stereotypes and assumptions. That kind of prejudice cuts deep. It makes you question whether your sacrifices mean anything at all." The courtroom fell silent as Marcus finished speaking. Even the defense team seemed momentarily struck by the raw honesty of his testimony. Lane cross-examined him afterward, attempting to poke holes in his narrative by questioning small details. But Marcus remained composed, refuting each challenge with clarity and conviction. As the trial progressed, tension simmered beneath the surface. Outside the courthouse, supporters rallied daily, chanting slogans and holding signs bearing Marcus's name. Critics gathered too, some shouting insults at protesters while others simply observed quietly. The divide between these groups reflected broader societal fractures, underscoring the complexity of the issues at play. Inside, closing arguments brought the trial to a dramatic climax. Rachel delivered a passionate plea for accountability, urging the jury to consider not only the evidence but also the broader implications of their verdict. "This is your chance to send a message," she implored, "a message that racism and abuse of power will not be tolerated, a message that Black lives matter." Lane countered with a final appeal to reason, reminding jurors that their duty was to evaluate the facts objectively, not to succumb to public pressure. "Do not let emotions cloud your judgment," he cautioned. "Decide this case based on the law and nothing else." With deliberations underway, the nation waited with bated breath. Would this trial mark a turning point in the fight against systemic injustice? Or would it reinforce cynicism about the possibility of real change? For Marcus, the answer lay not just in the verdict but in the courage shown by everyone who stood alongside him, refusing to let fear dictate the future. Whatever the outcome, he vowed to keep pushing forward, one step at a time.